Thank you very much for giving me the floor. This is one of the third webinar of uh, Asia Pacific a Forestry Education Coordination Mechanism, AP-FECM, uh, sponsored. And today, actually, we are going to hear from Dr. Mark Hunt, the professor of forestry science, and with the topic title National Initiatives Underway Across the University Sector to Support the Education in the Plantation Forest Industry. Dr. Hunt is professor uh, of forestry science at the University of Tasmania, Australia. Uh, Not only that one, is with his professor for a long decade at University of Tasmania. He actually showed a huge talent in his leadership, particularly administrative leadership in forestry education and research. Um, I, he was the head. He is the head of biological science and also the dean of natural science, and also he is the pro vice chancellor of transformation of that university. Dr. Mark was the inaugural director of National Center of Future Forest Industries and director and chief investigator of the Australian Research Council Industrial Transformation and Transformation Training Center of Forest Value. So not only that one, actually, for over 6 years, Dr. Mark was additionally a non-executive director on the board of Sustainable Timber Tasmania. From his profile, it is very evident that he is really one of the key person in forestry sector, particularly at Tasmania. And Dr. Mark was worked internationally on a range of forestry programs, including and funded projects supporting national, regional livelihood in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia through large-scale projects in support of the industrial forestry sector in the United States and Chile. So it is obvious that he has a practical and uh, authoritative uh, authoritative education level for the forestry sector, particularly plantation forestry sector. Not only that things, one of the things which actually impressed me a lot that he worked not only the uh, sector of Australia or Southeast Asia as, or the Asia Pacific region. He actually spent Antarctica as a station leader at Australia's busiest Antarctic base, Casey Station, and is currently a non-executive director at the non-profit charity Blue Land Laundries. So this is a wonderful event is going to be placed here, and I'm asking Dr. Hunt for his 2 days uh, seminar, presenting the 2 day seminar. And very good morning from our part. I think good evening for the for Canada, and also Dr. Mark. Please, Dr. Hart.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. It's very nice to be here this morning, this evening, this afternoon, and to see all of you online. I'd also like to thank Susie for helping to organise me here today, and Antanas for asking me along. I see some other colleagues online, John Ennis, of course, who I'm sure everybody knows, but also Chris Weston from University of Melbourne, and Chris, I hope what I have to say about the University of Melbourne forestry course over time today is right, because I'm sure you will know if I make any mistakes. So I'm going to try and share my screen. I'm hoping I'll be allowed to do that. And I am and I'd like you to please let me know if you are looking at the screen that I hope you are, which is a PowerPoint presentation with a title slide on it. Is that what everybody is seeing?
Yeah, we are seeing is the
Excellent.
forestry education.
Forestry education in Australia, a brief history and current aspirations. So I was asked today to talk a little bit about what we are doing in Australia to provide education to support the forestry and forest product sectors. And I felt that it was important to understand the journey that we had come on, which will not be dissimilar to that which a lot of you are familiar with from your own places of work and own countries. I have on the opening slide here a photograph of the opening of the Australian Forestry School on the 24th of November 1927 in Canberra. That's not when the Forestry School opened, but it was when it was opened in Canberra. And it was a prestigious event.
Seeing your sharing slides.
You're not seeing the slide? Okay. Let's try something.
Yeah, it's black.
It's not visible. It's black.
Okay, we will.
Yeah, it's okay now.
It's okay now?
It's okay.
Okay, I'll keep going. Please let me know if that changes. So what we're looking at is it was a large event, and you can see on the photograph there that it was attended by the Governor General and the Prime Minister. This was no small issue. It was recognised early in the 20th century that forestry education was very important to forest management and timber production in the country. Now, I'm going to acknowledge before I go any further, and I hope again you're looking at the second slide in my slide deck with some names there. Are people seeing that?
Yeah, we are seeing that.
We're seeing that. Terrific. So there's been a lot written about this over time, and I'd just like to note Peter Konofsky at ANU, Rod Keenan, University of Melbourne, Jerry Van Clay at Southern Cross University have all written a great deal about this over time, and I'm relying on their information to a great deal today. Acknowledge Professor Juliana Riley-Wopsler at the University of Tasmania, who's made a significant contribution to the work I'll talk about later in the presentation, and also to Dr. Don White, who's currently at Scion in New Zealand, formerly of CSIRO, who undertook quite a lot of the work 7 or 8 years ago, understanding what the demand was for forestry education in Australia. What I'm going to do over the next half an hour or so is briefly cover the establishment and growth of forestry education in Australia, talk about the decline, which has happened over a number of years, look at how the sector itself and the tertiary education sector has responded to that in the past and what the results have been, map out a different approach that we're currently taking, and then finally talk about some of our aspirations for where that may lead if we're successful. So if we go back to the Australian Forestry School, the Australian Forestry School motto you can see here, dating back 100 years now, or nearly 100 years. The motto there, to me, the care of the future. I'm sure something that any forester in this session or elsewhere will appreciate and agree with. The Australian Forestry School was established in 1911 in South Australia at the University of Adelaide. It was superseded 15 years later by the establishment of the Australian Forestry School, also at the University of Adelaide, which was then moved to Canberra, to the under the Commonwealth Bureau of Forestry in 1927. The Australian Forestry School continued for some 40 years as an independent education and training institution until 1965. It was subsumed into the Australian National University and became the first forestry degree offered out of an Australian university at that time, and continued then for close to half a century. You can see here I have some photos on the left is the hallway entering the Australian Forestry School as it was established in Canberra, and on the right, the original building, the Prince of Wales building, where forestry was originally taught in the second decade of the 20th century in Adelaide. The Victorian Forestry School was established at about the same time. There was a very early recognition of the need to train foresters in Australia. There's significant discussions that can be found in the archives in the late 1880s in Victoria in particular about this. And the Victorian Forestry School was established in 1910, so a year before the Australian Forestry School, before the courses at Adelaide University. That school was established at Creswick, which is a little way outside of Melbourne, and it was very much a training school that offered what would later be seen as diplomas rather than degrees. The University of Melbourne started offering a forestry degree in 1943, and there was a lot of interplay between the Forestry School at Creswick, offering technical training, if you like, and the University of Melbourne offering a more professional finishing education. And to some extent, they became increasingly articulated over time. And there was quite a clear distinction between what was offered at Creswick and what was offered at Melbourne, until in 1980, the University of Melbourne assumed full control of Creswick, and Creswick became part of the University of Melbourne's forestry degree. The third university in Australia to offer forestry education was Southern Cross University, and that commenced in 1996, the Bachelor of Applied Science in Forestry. There was a community, very much a community focus that was in line with the institution's ethos as a regional institution, a regional university. Very much pushed the boundaries of work integrated learning, about engaging with local landholders and industry to participate in the teaching and research. They focused a lot on small scale forestry and integrated land use, and developed strong engagement with the Pacific region, which of course was something that the other universities offering forestry degrees had already done. This four-year degree was later renamed as the Bachelor of Forest Science and Management rather than Applied Science Forestry, a trend in naming and nomenclature that was followed more broadly. So you can see that by 1996, we've progressively had 1, 2, and then 3 universities in Australia offering specific forestry degrees. And in addition to those, there was a series of research vehicles that offered postgraduate training, which became an increasingly important part of education and training in the sector more generally. So we had 3 cooperative research centres from 1991 to 2012, and then 2 other vehicles that followed those for another decade, where a large number of masters and PhD students graduated with a focus on forestry. So if we're to take ourselves to that period in the late 90s, early 2000s, where we have an active cooperative research centre pumping out PhD students, we have 3 forestry schools with undergraduates. What happened? So this is something that was felt internationally, not simply in Australia, and a lot of people have written about it. Here's simply an example from North America that interest in forestry simply declined. Students were much more led into courses that were seemingly more interesting, less applied to resource management and more applied to policy, social sciences, ecology, those sorts of things. And this was a shift that was seen right across the world. If we look at some of the analyses that were undertaken in Australia in the sector, we can see that we had a very significant reduction in people graduating in forestry over that period. An example here that some of the Australian authors listed, there was 50% decline in completions over the 7-year period in the early 2000s. And if we look further afield, again in Australia, and Jim Prattley again was key in this work, we can see that in the agricultural sector, we saw the same decline. And perhaps the most useful part of this graph is the right-hand all ag area, where we can see that we have a reduction to less than 50% of completions across agriculture in that period of a decade or so. So the key points here I'm wanting to make are that there is an international decline in people showing an interest in studying forestry, not just in Australia, and that this is not simply about forestry per se, but it is more broadly about resource management, professional resource management, including agriculture. So this was recognised in Australia. The university certainly recognised it, and the industry, and looking to understand what steps could be taken to reverse this. And different institutions took different approaches. So Southern Cross University in 2006 responded by providing an opportunity to study in Mount Gambier in South Australia, where there was a very strong and continues to be a very strong forest industry, essentially looking to take the university to where the people are and where the industry is. That was a successful for a period of time, but there was clearly pent-up demand, so that early enrolments were very good. But as that pent-up demand was met, the continuing demand proved insufficient to maintain the course in the long run. Other responses were University of Melbourne at about the same time moved towards the Bologna approach, where undergraduate degrees moved to 3-year degrees with specialisations to be found in 2-year masters subsequently. And a 4-year forestry degree no longer fit into that worldview. And similarly, ANU, Australian National University, moved to an approach where the 4-year degree became a 3-year degree, and that 3-year degree was much broader around forest and environment rather than professional forestry per se. So we see that the 3 forestry schools in Australia each responded to the changed circumstances and the reduction in potential students in different ways. A little bit later, the emphasis was focused more on postgraduate. This, of course, is very consistent with the Melbourne approach, where generalist undergraduate degrees, 3-year degrees, were then followed by more professional focused master's degrees of 2 years. And so the National Forestry Masters Program was developed. The National Forestry Masters Program was a concept put together by Rod Keenan at University of Melbourne, Jerry Van Clay at Southern Cross, and their colleagues, of course, as well as Jim Reid at University of Tasmania and Peter Konofsky at ANU, amongst others. And the concept there was that whilst any one university perhaps may not be able to attract students to their institution sufficient for a forestry degree, whether that be undergraduate or masters, if the institutions worked together and they drew on the more limited expertise that now existed within each institution, and we looked at a national cohort of students, then there'd be sufficient to make the master's program viable. And so this was run for a number of years. The students could enrol at one of several universities. Several universities contributed, and it was quite successful in that a significant number of students went through the degree, through the program, but ultimately it too was found to not be viable under the market mechanisms that currently drive the viability of courses in the Australian university sector. You can see on the right here too that we have that wasn't the only attempt. Others have attempted to look at a master's program as opposed to the more traditional undergraduate 4-year degree. We've had the Southern Cross Master of Forest Science and Management program. This was a 2020 advertisement that's no longer being run. And of course, we still have the Master of Forest Science program being run through University of Melbourne, which again is a much broader program than what we'd traditionally consider to be forestry, but still, of course, has very strong elements of forestry and very suitable for people coming through, as is the programs through ANU. The point here, though, is that certainly the education, both at undergraduate and postgraduate level, is very much broader. It's about forests, and the idea of professional forestry focus is no longer what's driving these programs. And just a little bit further, an example of review more than 10 years ago now, whilst those things were still going wrong, but I'll move on. So a different approach in about 2015 or 16, when it was clear there was a significant concern raised by industry that now that the traditional forestry schools were no longer offering the 4-year degrees, that they were struggling to recruit the people they needed to work in the industry. And there was a great deal of recruitment internationally, particularly from South Africa and New Zealand, but from a range of other places as well, and an increasing recruitment of people into the industry who came from backgrounds other than forestry. So the industry was interested in what could be done about this. We undertook Don White and I undertook a project where we surveyed institutions, industry players, and others about what the needs were what the demand was and what kind of training was needed. And from that, it was clear that there was a continuing gap between supply and demand for the wood products. There was certainly everything indicated that forest industry in Australia was something that was going to continue and be viable. This was not a dying industry or a dying sector where we didn't need trained people recruited into it. And more than that, there were new opportunities coming through in addition to the traditional forestry, including both voluntary and regulated carbon markets, opportunities for biofuels and biomaterials. There was certification and regulation. And there was also the important role that Australia needs to play regionally in working with our partner countries in the Pacific. So essentially, there were voices suggesting that it was okay that we weren't really training foresters anymore because we weren't going to need them because we didn't do that anymore. It was a dying sector, and that was clearly not the case. Having answered that question, we're interested, well, is there sufficient demand? Because people have tried these things before. If there was demand, then we would not have, we would still have forestry degrees being run. So what is the demand that's out there? And it was clear that there were two things that became clear. The first one is that there are a lot of people being recruited into jobs, both in the private sector and government, who were involved in managing forests in one way or another. But they're simply coming in without forestry degrees. They are being recruited from people with general science degrees, environmental management degrees, natural resource management degrees, agriculture, a whole range of different degrees where they have many, many skills, many of which are very, very clearly related to their work in forest management and in the forestry sector. It was also clear that the demographic of forestry professionals in Australia was ageing. This is an old figure, but in 2017, it was estimated that up to 50% of experienced professionals would retire in the next 5 to 10 years. Well, we're already 5 years into that, or we're getting close to 10. So, and we've seen that. We've seen a lot of people moving out of the sector, which has made the driver for ensuring that we have appropriately trained and educated people in the sector even more important now than it was a decade ago. The photos I have here are a whole range of people who were being trained in forestry research at about that time, and only one of them in those pictures actually has a forestry degree, and that's Mauricio there, who has a forest engineering degree from Chile. Everybody else in that photograph has come to forestry from a background other than an undergraduate forestry degree. And that was very typical of what we're seeing at the time. We then asked ourselves the question, what kind of training do we need? And it was very much about specific forestry skills, because as mentioned with the last slide, the people coming into the sector were being trained in a whole lot of essential science skills. They're being trained in critical thinking and writing. It was really a dearth in some specific forestry skills that industry was feeding back to us with a concern. And there was a range of ways in which this could be met. Certificates, graduate certificates, job placements, certificate placements. There was a number of possibilities put forward, and they were particularly in those areas mentioned below, such as inventory, fire behaviour, planning, wood science, the sorts of things that we're not going to find in an ag science degree or a science degree. However, as much as there was a strong demand for students, for people to come and work in the sector, and there were people being trained, there was and continues to be a paradoxical problem where we have trained people, we have jobs, but it's difficult to pull the two together. And that essentially is not completely, but it's in many ways it's down to a perception problem in the sector. You see two pictures on your right. The top one is it's actually a log yard in Austria. The bottom one's Clearfield Creek in Australia, but it's cut down logs and very unattractive landscape. And unfortunately, in attracting people to the sector and to being educated in the sector, these are the images that many of the students or potential students have in their head when we talk about forestry. Not all those other images about growing and managing forests. The big challenge, if we were to get students in, was to understand how to break this misconception and get potential students to think of us as something other than a resource depleting practice. I'll come back to that. A further part of the work that we did in 2016-17 was to look at potential international and national partnerships with other countries and institutions that were finding the same problem. So we expanded some of the ideas around the national masters and looked further afield at potential partners in Australia, but we also looked at some of our research partners internationally, particularly in South America and South Africa, to understand what opportunities there might be provided by taking more of an international approach to training rather than a very local national approach. So where did we get to? Essentially from this work, we understood that we needed to provide quite specialist professional education to fill the gaps or to give greater focus. We understood that many of the students will already be employed in the sector. And for those not employed in the sector, we're going to attract students often that have already some experience, who already have a degree, who have come in and already studied a range of other things, and as they've progressed in their study, have understood more of what forestry offers and the opportunities around it that perhaps is much greater than what they've come to university or to the workforce understanding. We really need to be able to address a large catchment of students to make any course viable. These are things that were recognised, of course, at the start of the Forestry Masters 2 decades ago. But more importantly, I suppose the new pieces of the puzzle that we've tried to focus on is we need to use small bites. We need to think about exit awards, and we need to think about micro-credentials. So those of you who aren't immersed in the university sector, these expressions may mean nothing to you. I'll go into that in a little bit more in a moment. And also in Australia, we have the Universities Accord that's just been released, which is essentially the future of how the Commonwealth Government's going to treat look at universities in their role in the country. There will be some new focus areas and a move away from some old ones, and it's important we understand what those are. And as it turns out, it looks like they will benefit what we're trying to do around forestry education. So where has this led us? What we're doing is offering a graduate certificate in forestry. It's really important here is that it is a small qualification. It's only 4 units. It is very much, it's not requiring a student or a potential student to commit years of their life and a great deal of money. It's also perhaps less challenging for people whose undergraduate degree or other education at some time in the past. The graduate certificate has 4 units, 2 core units and 2 electives. We would expect people generally to be undertaking 1 unit per semester, although they could undertake 2. And each unit is 25% of a full-time load. So completing 1 unit per semester over 2 years is certainly doable for a person with a demanding full-time job if they're committed to it. The units are offered online. We have an intensive field week for each unit, but this very much opens up the opportunity for people to do whilst they're working. That allows us to recruit people into the course from all over the country and beyond, potentially. And it means that the focus on having to be away from work and family can be concertinaed into a short, specific period of time. The units, like with the previous forestry masters, are coordinated and convened by academics from several universities. So ANU with Peter Konofsky, we have University of Melbourne and Antanas Spakavikius, who's on this session from University of Melbourne. We have University of the Sunshine Coast, Southern Cross University, University of Tasmania, University of Adelaide and Murdoch University in Western Australia have all been in conversations together about this. Importantly, so that we can ensure that whilst we have a very distributed, capacity in academic leadership in forestry in Australia, that we find ways to bring that expertise into a single place and offer that benefit to the students. One of the key ways that we're looking at, that we have been doing this, is with our online sessions, making sure that only about a third of our 90-minute online session is what might be considered a more traditional lecture, with one of us providing information. And the other 2/3, we've brought in industry leaders, thought leaders, to talk and lead discussions with students. So it's very much an interactive online experience, and definitely not a lecture in the traditional sense. We're relying on that sort of information to be conveyed to the students through the online reading lists and other prepared material that the students have access to online. We've started this year just with a single unit in this semester, and that is that unit's called An Introduction to Forestry, and Prof. Peter Konofsky is convening that with me assisting. And we've essentially talked about the history of the sector in Australia, governance, forest practices, legislation, some of the different contexts within which forestry is conducted in Australia, and what the different needs are and challenges are. And finally, some broader perspectives of forestry, looking at the social license narrative, the way that the sector is portrayed in the media, and just as importantly, how we can interact with the media positively, an understanding of forestry's role in the economy, and more broadly, issues such as fire. We have a field trip that's coming up, and that's being held in the university mid-semester break in April. We have 19 students enrolled, and all of those students are fully funded by industry. And this was an absolutely critical part of getting the course up and going. The universities are very much market-driven institutions these days. Other colleagues online who are in universities would I'm sure agree that each institution has a minimum number of students that they require to run a course in order for it to be viable. And so it was understood by industry that without a guarantee of a minimum number of students then simply there was no capacity for us to be able to run a course. And so the sector, through the auspices of the Australian Forest Products Association, has agreed to ensure that for 5 years they can guarantee a minimum number of students to be enrolled in the graduate certificate, and that's been absolutely critical for us to get this underway. Second semester this year, we're looking at running our second subject, which we're hoping to be a carbon forestry unit out of University of Melbourne. I think the general agreement across the sector is that the role of carbon forestry is critical, and we need to get that into the program early. And then potentially next year, we will be bringing in further units, probably in silviculture and forest operations, but we're very much responding to, one, the needs of industry, who are providing the scholarships, if you like, for the people to enrol, but also our students. We want to very much understand where they are seeing the gaps in their knowledge for their day-to-day work, and so we can respond to those. And we'll continue to run those intensive programs during the university breaks at the same time each year, and they seem to work pretty well with the ebb and flow of the various needs of the companies and the people who are working for them. If we're successful over the next several years, we hope to consider expanding the graduate certificate to a graduate diploma by adding an additional 4 units. Likely to include things like harvesting and haulage, biodiversity and natural capital, forest health, spatial technologies. We can look at some possible participation by other universities in Australia, and we would be looking at the completion of the graduate certificate as a prerequisite. So once a person receives their certificate, they can then choose to either go on and complete a diploma or not. There is the potential, of course, for that graduate diploma to then be accepted as an entry into a master's program. There's a lot of work to do before that proceeds, but certainly we will be designing the graduate diploma, the graduate certificate, then the graduate diploma, in a way that ensures their articulation to a master's as possible. We very much want to look at structuring the individual units into micro-credentials with the capacity for stacking. And so, for instance, there with a single unit like Introduction to Forestry that we're running this semester, eventually we'd like to break that down perhaps into 3 components, each one of those components providing a micro-credential that a person may undertake and then stack together to give credit for that unit. It opens up the opportunity for education to a greater number of people. It allows for people with less time or less confidence, or who's still thinking about whether or not they want to really proceed, to have a smaller taste, and ultimately provides us with an opportunity to create a greater number of pathways into education and training than we already have. So certainly at the moment, while we're in the way that we're designing our units, we're keeping in the back of our mind that we want them structured in a way that is suitable for stacked micro-credentials. And importantly, I mentioned earlier the university's accord that's recently been released, and there's certainly a number of proposals for government support to be able to have a financial model that is a foundation for micro-credentials. We're looking at engaging with regional universities and companies more. A couple of examples there. I'm currently involved with Fiji National University, talking to them about what opportunities what we're doing here may present for them and some of their neighbours. And I would like to see, once we get this moving, the opportunity for the development of an international cohort in the graduate certificate. And if that was successful, we could see the opportunity to have international and Australian participants engaged in the same online components, but we could offer separate intensive field trips in country if there was sufficient interest. The key, though, the key challenge is over the next 4 to 5 years that we have a financial model that is viable to ensure that the course is developed in a way that's financially self-supporting by the end of that 5 years. We have a guarantee by industry at the moment that they will pay for a minimum number of students to participate for that period of time, whether they find it useful or not. So clearly we need to ensure that they do find it useful and that they don't need to have any contractual obligation in order to continue to support students, to support their workforce, to become students in the course beyond that 5 years. And that is where I finish. Over to you, Mohammed.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, particularly on the forestry education and in Australia. Actually, I'm also very much interested at that topic, particularly how actually you are, as you tell, from the 1907 when the Act is promulgated in Australia about the forestry sector, and how 1940 actually the University of Melbourne started the business, the way actually we are taught our the modern forestry science, and later the way the Australia faced about the declining of the forestry education sector, and again you are making it up to the level the level of the education actually it deserves, particularly the country. However, I am just wondering about what about the forest fire. uh, I didn't find the specific courses or the topic, or which is actually directly relevant with the climate change as well. So if you kindly let me know something about this thing, and then I'll start actually. In the meantime, I'll ask the audience, those who are interested to make questions to Dr. Hunt, please raise your hand over the computer, please. Please, Dr. Hunt.
Thanks, Mohammed. I have colleagues, Antanas and Chris, both here from University of Melbourne, and I think that they may wish to comment, but certainly, yeah, at Melbourne, at ANU, right across Australian universities, there's very much a strong focus and very good educational opportunities in underpinning forest science, helping students to understand the impacts of climate change, understanding the underpinning issues around soils, water, fire, ecology, those sorts of things. Where we've had a move away from is the more specific professional aspects that a forester requires, such as in more how do we manipulate fire in order to achieve what we want in the landscape. So it's but even that I think is being pretty well handled. Fire is something in Australia that doesn't go unnoticed, and there's a lot of emphasis put on it. I don't know if Antanas, if you would have
I can jump in. Yeah, I can jump in quickly if you like. We still do offer a graduate certificate in bushfire planning and management. So those courses are still able to sustain themselves, and they're sort of nested in master's programs. So students doing something in the environmental sciences can take subjects in fire, but we also package essentially four subjects together to make up a graduate certificate in that particular area for those wanting to specialise.
Okay, thank you. There is I think, Professor Innes, if you take the floor, that will be nice then.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mark, for a very interesting presentation. I'm here in Vancouver with my two Australian doodles, Jara and Carrie. You might actually understand the significance of those names. No one else does. Anyway, yeah. I'm interested to know, you mentioned a little bit about public opinion and public perception of forestry. And I think in Australia, it has been as polarized as it has been in British Columbia. And in some instances, that polarization has been led by individual academics and others. You managed to avoid mentioning any names in that direction. I won't mention them either. But I've seen a fairly strong reaction from what is now called, I think, Forestry Australia, in terms of actually trying to counter some of the propaganda that is being spread, some of the opinions that are being made. Do you think that's successful? Is it changing people's opinions about and their perception of forestry? Or is forestry still a dirty word in Australia?
They're really good questions, John. And it's difficult to answer that simply. As I imagine it is in BC, the forestry is only a dirty word in the inner city. It's not a dirty word once you get 30 kilometres outside of the central business district in most of Australia. But there still is that dichotomy of a regional perception of forestry and an urban perception of forestry. Forestry Australia has really lifted its efforts in advocacy very strongly. It's a challenge for the organisation, but that is starting to have some cut through, I think. I live in Hobart, as you know, and Tasmania is ground zero for this sort of public discourse. So there is some cut through, but not as much, not as much as you would hope. I think it comes back to where do most people who have a negative opinion of forestry get that opinion from? It's talking to their mate or reading their feed on Facebook, and so the only way that opinion is going to be changed is if, when talking to their mate or reading their feed on Facebook, they get new information. Providing information from another source is unlikely to do it. So I think there is a difference, but the dichotomy is still there, and it's got a long way to run. I think one of the things about, and I perhaps didn't make enough of this, what I find is, particularly when we get fresh-faced people coming to university at the start of their undergraduate degree, they want to save the universe, as we all did. And at that stage, they see that as working with wombats or achieving an activist outcome. By the time they've had 3 or 4 years of adulthood and education, a significant number of them realise the world's more complex than that, and their eyes are opened up to the potential of, managing resources is actually a pretty important part of feeding people, housing people, clothing people, bringing people out of poverty. And so their interest in degrees in fields such as forestry and agriculture is much greater. I think that's one of the real opportunities with focusing on something like a graduate certificate, is that we hit those people at that point in time, and we're not asking them to sign up for another 3 years. We're just saying, look, come and have a taste of this. You're thinking about how you're going to make a difference and how you're going to earn a living now. Here's an opportunity to have a look. We find that works really well. But thanks for your question, John.
Thank you.
Okay. Is there anyone to make any question to Dr. Hunt from the audience? I think one. So Damara,
Chris.
if you kindly put your question over there.
Sorry, did Damrong have a question?
I think he raised his hand, but later put it down again.
All right.
I think he was.
Look, I don't really have a question, Mark, but can you hear me?
Yeah, sure. Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
Long time.
Thanks, Elamin. It's good to see a renewed effort in this kind of applied forestry, forest science space at tertiary level. And I guess playing on John's question, is there still a kind of a push against forestry in Australia? And I think, one of the problems that educators have is being united in deciding that they want forestry or forest science within a program at an institution. And I think that's certainly been the case at Melbourne, where there is palpable resistance to forestry in the upper echelons of the science faculty that has led to a morphing of, let's call it forest science, environmental education to a more generalized concept. And the irony is that we've retained a lot of the applied aspects of forestry within the curriculum, but it's not obvious to students that it's there. And the ones that are there who are engaged in more kind of, let's call them general environmental science programs, are unable to kind of link to the opportunities that forestry offers. So, it's a vexed space, and it'd be good to hear your opinions on that.
Really interesting, Chris. And one of at University of Tasmania, my experience here, every time, and with this graduate certificate of forestry, there was an enormous push to call it something else. Do you have to call it forestry? Couldn't we call it forest this or forest, And interestingly, it wasn't coming from science; it was coming from other faculties. But that was certainly raised. I've been very lucky here. I spent 4 years as Pro Vice Chancellor, working really closely with the VC of UTAS, and that was mainly around the transformation program, the building rejuvenation. We did a lot of work on timber construction and timber supply chains and environmental credentials and certifications. So I was really lucky to have that opportunity to work with the university executive more generally, and help them understand the reality of, well, if you want lovely timber buildings, you're going to have to get the wood from somewhere. Where's that going to be? So at UTAS, we have a strong executive support for what we're doing and naming it up. And the fight tends to be more in some of the senior academic ranks of in the same places we find it in other universities. Yeah.
Well, more power to you. That's great.
Well, VCs come and go, so I have to make the most of this one while I've got it. Yeah. I noticed a question there in the chat about, do the foresters in Australia administrate through what ministry? And that's an interesting one. So it's the there are different ministries influence different aspects of university funding and operation. And the different universities in Australia are present under a variety of governance arrangements. So my university at University of Tasmania is established under a state government act. Other universities have been established under different state government acts, Commonwealth government acts, or as private organisations. The Commonwealth Education Department has a role. Science, whichever the science department is, and innovation department has a role. So it's a pretty complex set of arrangements, and it's certainly not uniform throughout the 40-odd universities in the country.
There are another question, I think, from Dr. Wang.
Yes. So yeah, any notable changes in the programs after over the last 2 decades? I think so certainly there have been those. There have been those that I talked about where we've had more of a focus on forest management rather than the profession of forestry. So there's much more about the underpinning science of what goes on in the forest, and much less around the active management of the forest in order to achieve outcomes per se. And we see that in the language of qualifications that are in forests, forest science, rather than forestry. You put that RY on the end, and all of a sudden it's more about active management and less about science processes. It's also meant a lesser emphasis on non-science aspects of forests. So we find fewer students. This may be different in other universities. I still think of I see less economics. I see less social science. Less engineering as part of people's education when they're studying aspects of forest science than was the case when it was more forestry per se. There's a question there about north-south collaboration, especially with developed countries and developing countries. Yes, Australia. So there's 2 things there. Australia has an enormous amount to gain from working with the Northern Hemisphere, particularly with Europe and North America. The developments in the product development around engineered products and building systems is critical for Australia, and we really need to have much stronger links there. We're also working with developing countries more regionally, and there's an opportunity there, I think, to. One of the things I'm doing with Fiji National University, and I'm hoping to extend further, is I think this approach we're taking to the graduate certificate, I think would work really well in some of our partner countries in the region, not just in the Pacific, but in Southeast Asia as well, although in forestry universities and forestry education remains so much stronger in most of Asia than it does here. So there are certainly opportunities there, and I think one of the things that I would like to see is to be raising the base educational or training attainment of workers in the sector, particularly regionally, by looking at offering a vocational, a BET style more VET style training in forestry, particularly in the Pacific. It's something that I didn't emphasise enough in the presentation I just gave, but one of the key aspirations that I have, and I think the industry should have, is to make that move from a very basic technical certificate right through more advanced certificates into diplomas, into pre-degrees, degrees. We need to make that articulation seamless so people can see pathways for increasing their training and education standard as long as they're working in the sector. And forestry and forest products, absolutely. It's been one of the. Certainly we're looking at ways we can do that with the graduate certificate. It's certainly been part of other efforts in the past. I think what makes me most optimistic about that is the integration between forestry and forest products research in Australia is much more explicitly integrated now than it was 20 years ago. I think it's fundamentally changed. We now, I remember 25 years ago, if we had our geneticists and tree breeders thinking about wood quality, then that was considered quite outside of the box. Whereas now we're, regardless of whether we're working on tree breeding or silviculture, harvesting, people are thinking about right through the value chain, and even now, most of the thought leaders in industry and in research are thinking beyond the processing mill, whether that's a sawmill or a chip or whatever, and really thinking about where the product ends up and how it will be applied. So if we can get that thinking that we've finally managed to get through to the research community over into our educational approach, I see that as really valuable. And I can't see any reason for that not happening now. It's a really good question. John's comment, yeah, John, I'm really interested in that. That laddering approach is basically what I've managed to, because it's fairly new here, I've managed to get the University of Tasmania to treat what I'm doing as a prototype. So that's provided me with access to some expertise and support and resources to develop it. But I would like to. I absolutely want to see somebody coming in and doing a third or a quarter of a unit micro-credential, and then from there being able to work their way right up through to a master's. We've got to be able to articulate that. But I want to see that that cross-institutional movement and the internationalisation of it. I think that's the there were a couple of slides where I talked about that 3/4 of the way through the presentation, but unless we make the most of the international opportunities in forestry, I think we're missing an opportunity, but I think we're going to struggle to stay relevant. And any new initiatives to attract students to study forestry in Australia? Well, this is what we're trying to do. So let's see how we go. Maybe this presentation will start some people thinking about telling others that they should come to Australia to study forestry. I think I've run out of questions in the chat there. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for inviting me along today, and I hope that was useful.
That's finished, and now thank you, Dr. Hunt, for the interesting talks. We're also hoping more students will go to Australia to study forestry after this presentation. Okay. So we will meet you everyone next time on March 10th, or no, April 10th. So I will also send out our like invitation for the next semester or for the next seminar. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank you.
Suji. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr.
This
Ami.
time